Support stays support. Wade Brandt's voice carried across the motor pool, bouncing off the fuel cans and the dust-caked hoods of the trucks, loud enough that every soldier within 50 meters turned to watch. He held the Overwatch roster in one hand and a black marker in the other, and he drew a thick line straight through Maren Holt's name while she stood there and watched him do it. "You patch holes, Doc. You don't make them. Stay with the aid bag. Stay with the trucks." A few of the younger guys laughed. It was the kind of laugh that's really just permission, the kind that follows a sergeant first class downhill because it feels safer than standing still. Brandt capped the marker. "We clear?" Maren Holt did not answer. She did not step forward. Her hands stayed loose at her sides, fingers still, no fists, no flexing. They were the hands of someone who had learned a long time ago that the body keeps secrets the mouth shouldn't. Her eyes went flat and even, the way still water goes flat right before the wind finds it. She looked at the line through her name, and then she looked at the ridge to the north. She had read the same threat report Brandt had. She just already knew which ridge it would come from. One of them was loud, the other one was right. "Crystal," she said. One word. Then she picked up the aid bag and walked to the trucks, and the people still laughing didn't understand that they had just watched the last easy morning of their lives. If you're new here, hit subscribe and drop your city in the comments, because I like knowing where in the world this story is landing tonight. And stay all the way to the end. Stay until the moment Wade Brandt has to key that radio with his whole element pinned down and his voice shaking, and ask, out loud, in front of everyone, for the medic he just benched. Stay for what it costs him to say her name. You want to see how far this one travels. Now let's go back, because to understand what happened on that ridge, you have to understand the woman they only ever called Doc. Combat Outpost Greywater sat in a high desert valley where the wind came down off the mountains every afternoon at 3 o'clock and sandpapered everything it touched. The heat ran past 120 by midday, and the dust got into the rifles, the food, the back of your throat. It was a small post, 40 soldiers, 2 crew-served guns, a single rutted road in and out that everyone hated because everyone knew exactly what a road like that was good for. Maren Holt had been there 4 months. Her file said one thing and one thing only: 68 whiskey, combat medic, support role. The paperwork didn't mention the 3 years before this unit ever met her, or the school in the mountains where they teach a person how wind lies, or the deployment nobody in this valley had the clearance to read about. The Army is a very large machine, and sometimes a person gets filed under the smallest true thing about them, and everyone stops reading there. The man who taught her to read wind was a retired master sergeant named Bishop, a quiet, sun-leathered scout sniper who had 2 rules and exactly 1 sense of humor. Bishop used to lie next to her in the grass for 9 hours without a word, and then say the same thing every time, soft, like he was telling her a secret the world didn't want her to have. Wind lies, math doesn't. He said it the way other men say prayers. He'd been killed 2 deployments back. On a hillside Maren still saw when she closed her eyes, and ever since she carried his voice around in her chest like a second heartbeat. She didn't talk about it. She channeled all of it, every ounce of weight, into the only place she trusted to hold it: her hands, her breathing, the slow math that turned chaos into a number she could hit. One afternoon during that long, quiet stretch, a young supply private named Sayer found her behind the maintenance tent with a rifle broken down across a poncho liner. He'd come to drop off batteries. He stopped instead because she was reassembling the weapon with her eyes half closed, faster than anything made sense, every part snicking home like it was magnetized to her fingers. Then she ran the bolt and started again. Sayer watched the whole cycle twice. That's, he said, that's a lot of practice for a medic. Marin didn't look up. Habit, she said. Sayer nodded like he understood, set the batteries down, and walked away. And he forgot about it by dinner, because he had no idea what he had just seen. He would remember it later. They all would. The disrespect wasn't only Myron's to carry. Specialist Tess Quinn was 23, loud where Myron was quiet, all elbows and opinions. The best vehicle gunner on the post, and the only one nobody would say so to. On the range, a week earlier, Tess had stacked rounds into the steel at 400 meters until the plate rang like a church bell. And Brant's favorite corporal had looked at her and said, "Lucky day, Quinn. Stay in your lane. Drive the truck." Tess carried that home with her for days. So when Marin found her at dawn, re-zeroing her optic alone in the cold, the two of them ended up shoulder to shoulder in the dirt. And Marin talked her through a wind call. The real way, Bishop's way, watching the mirage bend over the desert floor. Tess put 3 rounds into a fist-sized spot at 600 and turned to her, breathless. "How'd you know the wind'd do that?" Marin almost smiled. Almost. "It always tells you," she said. "You just have to be quiet enough to hear it." She looked at the younger woman a beat longer than she looked at anyone. "Loud's not the same as dangerous, Quinn. The loudest guy in the room is almost never the one you should be watching." It was the only warmth she let show that whole deployment, and it lasted about 4 seconds. Then she was up, all business again. But Tess never forgot it. The convoy that morning was supposed to be routine. Resupply run, 12 clicks south and back. Brant rode lead. Marin rode in the 3rd truck with the aid bag, and the line through her name, exactly where she'd been told to stay. Sayer was on the 50 in the 2nd vehicle. Tess drove the trail truck. Aiden Foster, 19 years old, with a kid sister back home, he'd promised to teach to drive, and a beat-up truck he and his dad were going to rebuild after deployment, sat in the back of Marin's vehicle and talked too much because he was nervous. They cleared the wire. They made the first turn. The valley opened up wide and brown and silent on both sides, and for exactly 9 minutes, everything was fine. Then the lead truck disappeared inside a wall of fire and dirt, and the world came apart. The pressure of the blast hit the convoy a half-second before the sound did, a flat, enormous slap that punched the air out of the trucks. The IED had been buried under the road they all hated, and it flipped the front vehicle onto its side in a screaming tangle of steel. Before the dust had even started to fall, the ridgelines lit up. Muzzle flashes stitched the high ground on both sides, the deep rolling hammer of a heavy machine gun opening up from the north, and rounds began walking across the convoy with the sound of a hailstorm hitting sheet metal. This was no harassment. This was an ambush, planned, layered, patient. They had let 9 minutes go by on purpose. Soldiers were screaming for cover. Soldiers were screaming for a medic. And up on the lead truck, pinned behind the wreck, with 2 of his men down and a heavy gun chewing the rock apart over his head, Wade Brant keyed his radio and learned that loud doesn't help you at all when the rounds are real. Gray water, we are in heavy contact. We are pinned. I have casualties. I have a heavy gun on the north ridge I cannot suppress. I cannot move. His voice was high and fast and cracking at the edges. The MG on the ridge thudded again, and rock dust rained down on him, and he flinched the way every human being flinches. And in that moment, the man who had drawn a line through Maren Holt's name understood with total clarity that no one in his element could reach that gun. They didn't have the angle. They didn't have the range. They didn't have the shooter. There was a silence on the net then, a long, ugly silence, 6 seconds of it, which in a firefight is an eternity. Everyone heard it. Sayer heard it on the 50. Tess heard it in the trail truck. Captain Tom Maddox heard it back at the post with his fists on the table. And then Wade Brandt did the hardest thing he had ever done in his life. Harder than the wreck, harder than the gun. He keyed the radio, and his voice dropped low, and it shook, and he said, "I need the medic. I need Holt. Get her on the gun. Get Holt up on that high ground. Right now, God damn it. She's the only one who can make this shot." The radio hissed. Nobody answered for a moment. Up in the trail truck, Tess Quinn turned and stared back through the dust at the third vehicle, and her mouth fell open, because she had heard something in Wade Brandt's voice that she'd never heard there before. She'd heard a man asking for help from the one person he swore could never give it. Back at the post, Captain Maddox keyed his handset and gave the order. And the order cost him something, too. "Holt." A breath. "Holt, get to the eastern shoulder and take that gun off my men. You're cleared. You're—" He stopped. He swallowed. "I should have had you up there an hour ago. Go." Maren was already moving. She had her rifle out of the rack and a drag bag over her shoulder before the captain finished talking, low and fast, along the lee of the trucks. And when she keyed her own radio, her voice came across the net clear and cold and absolutely level. And it stopped Wade Brandt's heart in his chest, because it was nothing, like the woman he thought he'd been mocking. "Eastern shoulder, moving now. Brandt, get your people flat and keep them flat. I need 90 seconds. No fear in it, no anger, just a flat clinical readiness, a surgeon's voice, the voice of someone who had done this in worse places than this." On the lead truck, pinned in the dirt, Wade Brandt heard the medic he'd benched talk like the most dangerous person on the battlefield, and something in him began, very quietly, to break. She came up onto the eastern shoulder at a low crawl and put the rifle into the rock. Below and across, the north ridge flickered with muzzle flashes. The heavy gun thundered, a deep mechanical heartbeat, and she could hear its rounds hitting the trucks in two different voices, the dull bong off the armor and the higher whine off the engine blocks. She let the breath out slow. She found the gunner. 410 meters, slight value wind, left to right, the mirage bending the way she'd shown Tess. First round. The rifle bucked into her shoulder with a sharp, flat crack that rolled out across the valley, and the heavy gun stopped. Just stopped. The silence where it had been was its own kind of sound. Two of the riflemen beside it swung toward her muzzle smoke, and she worked the bolt, smooth, the brass tinkling off the rock, and she fired twice more, two flat cracks a heartbeat apart, and they folded. 3. Down at the trucks, somebody started to cheer. She did not cheer. She was already counting the ones she couldn't see yet. That was when the far ridge spoke, and she learned that the enemy had brought a shooter of their own. The first round came in before she heard it, the way the bad ones do. A wasp snap past her ear and a crack off the rock 6 inches from her face that threw stone chips into her cheek. She rolled left without thinking, pure trained reflex, and a second round walked into the spot where her chest had been. Then a third, methodical, patient, someone good. She pressed herself into a fold in the rock no wider than her body, and felt the next round skip off the lip above her, and felt the pressure of it against her skin like a hand. Her heart slammed. The air smelled like hot stone and cordite, and her own blood from the chips in her cheek. She made herself breathe. She made herself think. A counter-sniper. Far ridge, elevated, maybe 700 meters, maybe more, working a slow rhythm. She had perhaps 2 seconds between rounds and 0 cover if she stayed. So she didn't stay. She low-crawled 6 meters along the dead ground to a notch in the rock while the rounds chased her, kicking up dirt that stung her hands, and she got there with her pulse roaring in her ears and a graze across her left forearm she didn't remember getting. A hot, wet line she'd deal with later. She had been on the gun for less than 90 seconds, and she had already nearly died once. "Halt! Sit rep!" Brant, frantic, over the net. "Counter-sniper, far ridge, workin' me," she said, flat as a ledger. "Stay down. Foster, talk to me." "Doc, I'm hit. I'm hit bad." Aiden's voice, thin and young and terrified, and then another voice cut in over the top of it, and her stomach dropped, because she heard the interpreter back at the post relaying intercepted enemy traffic in a fast, urgent whisper. Their command net had lit up the second her rifle started talking. They were pulling fighters back from the trucks. They were repositioning. And one phrase came through twice, fast, almost frightened. And the interpreter's voice cracked as he passed it. They were calling her something. A name from a war 2 valleys and 3 years away. A name for a shooter who had hunted them once from a high wall and whom they had never found, never seen, never identified, only feared. The ghost from the north wall. Somewhere out there, an enemy commander had a file on a marksman he'd put a price on and never caught. And he had just realized, from the sound of 3 rounds, that the price was lying on a ridge above his ambush, and that her own people had labeled her support and benched her with the aid bag. Her file said one thing. Their file said something else entirely. She didn't have time to feel anything about it. The far ridge shooter was still working, and her people were still dying, so she did the math. She bracketed his last muzzle flash, dialed her elevation, and waited, breathing, for him to give her one more. He did. She caught the flash and the heat shimmer of his hide at the same instant, and Bishop's voice came up through her chest, plain and quiet, the way he used to say it lying in the grass beside her. "Wind lies. Math doesn't." She trusted the math. The rifle cracked, the sound rolling away across the whole valley, and 740 meters away the enemy shooter's rifle went silent and stayed silent, and the far ridge belonged to her now. 4. She let herself breathe exactly once. Then she went back to work, because the trucks were still taking fire from the low rocks, and the day was not even close to over. The next stretch was the hardest shooting of her life, and she did it half-deaf and bleeding. The enemy in the low rocks were good, disciplined, moving in bounds, and she took them as they moved, one at a time. 5 and 6 rushed the trail truck and dropped before they cleared the rocks. 7 rose to fire and didn't finish. 8 and 9 broke left. 2 cracks, 2 down. 10 11. 12 came in a ragged rush, the bolts cycling like a metronome. 13 and 14 broke last, and neither reached cover, the brass piling warm against her cheek. Down below, Tess Quinn made the decision that saved the lead element. She gunned the trail truck across open ground under fire, swung it broadside between the wreck and the low rocks to make a steel wall, and got the 50 up and hammering, and the deep, slow thunder of that gun changed the whole shape of the fight. It was reckless. It was perfect. It was exactly the kind of call a driver who should stay in her lane is never supposed to make. "Doc, I got you cover," Tess screamed over the net, and Marin, working her bolt, said the closest thing to a thank you she had in her. "Good, don't stop." Then the net went quiet in a way that turned Marin's blood to ice. Red 2, respond." That was Maddox raising Tess's truck. Nothing. Static. Red 2, respond. Nothing. The 50 had stopped. Marin turned her head toward the trail vehicle and saw it sitting crooked and silent, smoke coming off the hood. And for 3 full seconds, she heard nothing but the hiss of an empty channel and the blood in her own ears, the whole world narrowing to a single question with no answer, and she felt something she had trained for years not to feel. Then Tess's voice broke through, ragged, coughing. "Red 2 up, RPG near miss. I'm okay. Guns down, but I'm okay." Marin let the breath out of her body. She hadn't known she was holding it. But the relief lasted 1 second, because the relief is always when the worst thing comes. A technical came around the far end of the valley, an old truck with a heavy DSHK bolted in the bed, and it came on fast and low, straight at the disabled convoy with the gun already firing. And that gun could turn every truck on that road into a coffin in under a minute. She did the count without thinking. Rounds left? Almost none. 2, maybe 3. The technical was far, 700 meters and opening up to 8, bouncing over the broken ground, the gunner hammering, and the only shot that mattered now was the gunner himself or the engine. And to take it, she had to come up out of the notch and expose her whole body to a valley that had already tried to kill her twice. She came up anyway. This is the part that trained men call impossible, so let me slow it down. She came up onto her elbows on the open rock, with the evening light going flat and gold, and the wind rising the way it always rose at 3 o'clock, and she could feel the whole sky on her back, no cover, nothing between her and the entire valley but air. The technical bounced and yawed at 760 meters, a moving target on broken ground, the worst kind of shot there is. Her left forearm was slick with her own blood, and her hands wanted to shake, and she would not let them. She heard the DSHK rounds coming in, heavy and slow, cratering the rock to her right, marching toward her one impact at a time. And she heard her own heartbeat, and she heard Bishop, calm as still water. Wind lies, math doesn't. She led the cab. She held for the wind she could not trust, and the drop she could. She had, she knew, 1 round in the rifle, and a moving truck, and about 2 seconds before the DSAK found her, and there would be no second shot. She breathed out half a breath, and held the rest, and let the trigger break on its own. The rifle cracked 1 last time, the sound rolling out across the whole valley and coming back off the mountains. And 760 meters away, the Technical's windshield starred, and the truck swerved hard and rolled, the heavy gun flipping end over end across the dirt. And then there was nothing on that road but smoke, and the ringing in everyone's ears, and the brass cooling on the rock beside a woman who had just done the single most difficult thing any of them would ever witness. For a moment, nobody on the net said anything at all. Then Marin keyed her radio, and her voice was as flat and quiet as it had been at the very start, and she said 2 words that landed on that valley like a stone dropped into a deep well. Engagement complete. 15 down. Then she set the rifle down, and she became someone else. She came off the ridge at a run, and by the time she reached the trucks, she had already slung the rifle across her back and pulled the drag bag around to her front, and the same hands that had been doing flat cold math 30 seconds earlier were tearing open a chest seal and finding a vein. Aiden Foster was on his back in the dirt by the 3rd truck, gray-faced, a wound high in his side, and his blood soaking dark into the sand under him. And his eyes were huge and wet and 19 years old. He grabbed her sleeve when she dropped down beside him. His hand was cold. "Doc," he said, and his teeth were chattering even in the heat. "Doc, am I gonna die? Tell me. Tell me the truth. Am I dying?" And Marin Holt, who had killed more men in the last 10 minutes than most soldiers see in a career, looked the boy dead in the eyes, and her whole face changed, the flatness gone, something steady and warm and absolutely certain rising up in its place, and she put her bloody hand flat against the side of his face the way you'd hold a child. "Not today, Foster," she said. "You hear me? Not today. You've got a sister to teach to drive. You're going home." She said it like a fact. She said it like a promise. And she made her hands move while she said it, fast and sure, sealing the wound, getting fluid into him, talking the whole time in a low, even voice about the truck he was going to rebuild with his dad, keeping him here, keeping him with her, anchoring him to the world with her words, while her fingers did the saving. "Stay with me. Eyes on me. There you go. You feel that? That's me. I've got you." His breathing steadied. His color came back, an inch at a time. And the soldiers around her watched the killer they'd just witnessed turn into the gentlest thing on that road. The same precision, the same calm, aimed now at keeping a boy alive instead of stopping a man. And not one of them ever called her, just the medic again. She got Foster onto the bird with a pulse and a future, and she kept her promise, every word of it. 3 days later, they were back in the motor pool where it started, in the same dust by the same trucks. And the thing that happened there happened slowly, in separate pieces, because some things can't be rushed. Wade Brandt found her first. He came across the gravel stiff and heavy, the way a man walks toward something he can't go around. And he stopped a few feet from her, with the whole platoon close enough to hear, the same audience that had laughed 3 mornings ago. He opened his mouth, and nothing came out. He tried again. "Holt!" His voice, the voice that used to fill this whole yard, came out small and rough and cracked on the second word. I need to say..." He stopped, jaw working, and looked at the ground, and looked back up. And the audience watched a man who had built his whole life out of being the loudest one in the room try to find a quieter way to stand. "I drew a line through your name," he said, "in front of everybody. And it wasn't just a bad call about a roster." His hands were shaking, and he didn't hide it. "I decided what you were before I ever watched you do a single thing. I decided it because it was easier than wondering if you were better than me. And you were up on that ridge, keeping my men breathing while I was face down behind a wreck. And I had to say your name on that net to live. and I'll be hearing my own voice asking for you for the rest of my life." His throat worked. He stood there with his whole posture collapsed. No rank left in his shoulders. Just a man in front of other men, admitting he'd been wrong about a person's worth. "I'm not asking you to square it with me. I don't get to ask that. I just needed everybody who heard me laugh to hear me say it." And he went quiet, and the yard went quiet, and everyone waited. Marin looked at him for a long moment. 6 seconds, the same 6 seconds the radio had hung silent that morning. She didn't smile. She didn't gloat. There was nothing in her face but a kind of weary, level understanding. The understanding of a person who has been read wrong her whole career by people who never bothered to turn the page. And she gave him 2 words. 2 words that were not forgiveness and were not a victory. 2 words that named the only thing that was actually true between them. "Files lie," she said. Then she nodded once, and that was all. And somehow it was enough, and somehow it was the heaviest thing said in that yard all day. Captain Maddox came to her separately, later, when the light was going long and gold. He didn't call her into the command tent. He came out to where she was sitting on a tailgate, cleaning her rifle, and he stood there a while without speaking, and then he did something officers almost never do. He sat down on an ammo can below her, lower than her eye line, and he stared at the far wall of the motor pool for a long time before he could get to it. You could watch him arriving at it in real time. Watch him deciding to actually say the thing instead of the easier version of the thing. "I read your file when you got here," he finally said. 68 whiskey. Support. And I filed you exactly that fast. And then I let a man under my command treat you like furniture for 4 months. And I told myself it wasn't my problem because I had bigger ones." He rubbed a hand down his face. "It wasn't him. It was all of us. It was me. I had the most dangerous shooter in this valley sleeping in my wire, and I let her carry the aid bag because the paperwork told me to, and it nearly got my people killed." He stood up then, slowly, and squared himself, and looked her in the eye, soldier to soldier, no rank between them for a second. "You had the ridge, Sergeant. 4 words. That was all. Not praise. Recognition." Then he told her the rest. The concrete part. The part that mattered more than any speech. She was off the medic-only roster as of that morning. Designated marksman and senior medic both. On every Overwatch rotation from here out. And the recommendation he'd written had a word in it she'd see when the award came down. He didn't wait for thanks. He knew better. He just nodded and walked away and left her with the gold light and the clean rifle. But the thing that proved Wade Brandt had actually changed wasn't anything he said to her. It was something that happened a week later when a fresh replacement rolled in, a cocky kid still smelling of the rear, who saw Marin walk past with the aid bag in one hand and her rifle in the other, and smirked to the guys around him. "What's the doc need a sniper rifle for?" he said, loud, fishing for the same laugh Brandt used to fish for. And Wade Brandt was across that yard before the kid finished the sentence. And he got right in his face, low and hard, and absolutely certain. "That's not the doc," Brandt said. "That's the best shooter in this battalion. And the only reason you've got people here to teach you how things work is that she was up on a ridge doing your job and hers at the same time, while better men than you were eating dirt. You don't call her doc. You don't call her anything until you've earned the right to say her name." He didn't stop there. He pulled the kid by the sleeve and walked him over and made him stand next to Marin, the same way Brandt himself now stood beside her on every brief. On the same side of the room he used to stand against her on. "You watch how she works," he told the kid. "You watch, and you keep your mouth shut, and maybe you learn something." And he meant every word of it, and you could see that he meant it in the way he carried himself now, the loudness gone out of him, replaced by something steadier and smaller, and a great deal more real. Private Sayer found her too, the supply kid who'd watched her field strip that rifle behind the maintenance tent a lifetime ago and walked off thinking it was just a lot of practice for a medic. He came up shy and earnest, with his hands jammed in his pockets. "I saw you with that rifle, that one time, weeks ago," he said. "And I had no idea what I was looking at." He shook his head slowly. "I've been telling everybody. I keep telling them. She saved all of us. Every single one of us got to come home because of her." He said it simple and flat, the way the truest things get said, and then he ducked his head and went back to his batteries. But he'd carry that sentence around for the rest of his life. That night, Marin found Tess Quinn sitting alone behind the trucks, with her knees drawn up, shaking. The shaking that comes a few days late, when the body finally catches up to what it survived, when it sinks in that the RPG that flipped your gun missed your head by a foot. Marin didn't say much. There wasn't much to say. She sat down next to her in the dirt and put a hand on the younger woman's shoulder, and just stayed, solid and present, while Tess cried it out, the way Marin herself had learned to let other people feel the things she couldn't afford to feel in the moment. "You drove into the open," Marin said quietly, after a while, "under fire, to make me a wall. Nobody told you to do that." Tess wiped her face and let out a wet laugh. "Stay in my lane, right?" And Marin, for the second time, that entire deployment, almost smiled. "Your lane," she said, "is wherever you decide it is. Maddox put your name in the write-up. Both our names." Tess looked at her then, and something passed between them, and it was the kind of thing that doesn't need words, the kind built out of two people who were exactly as good as they needed to be on the worst day either of them had ever seen. It was Maddox who told her about the file. In the end, the other file, the enemy's. He'd gotten the full intel readout back from the intercepts, and he brought it to her himself. And he stood there, a little stunned by it. The enemy had a dossier on a marksman from a war 3 years gone, a shooter who'd hunted a network from a high wall and vanished, never caught, never named, only feared. They'd put a bounty on that ghost and kept the file open for years. And the SIG-int was unmistakable. The second her rifle started talking in that valley, the enemy commander had recognized the signature, and his own traffic had named her, the ghost from the north wall, and ordered his people to pull back from a shooter he'd spent 3 years afraid of. "Your file said support role," Maddox said quietly, looking at the page like it had rearranged itself. "Their file said you were the most dangerous person any of them had ever failed to kill." He shook his head. 4 months. You were here 4 months, and we never read past the first line." Marin took the page, looked at it for a long moment, and handed it back. "Files lie," she said again. And that was the last time anyone ever needed to explain who she was. A few weeks later, before dawn, Marin was out on the eastern shoulder again, alone, re-zeroing her rifle in the cold blue light, the valley quiet below her and the wind not yet up. There was no fear in her now, and there was no triumph either. There was just the particular peace of a person who, on the one day it actually counted, on the worst day of 40 people's lives, had been exactly and completely who she was, no more and no less, with nothing held back and nothing to apologize for. She thought about Bishop, the way she always did up high in the early light, and she heard his voice come up quiet through her chest. The second thing he used to say, the thing about not getting to be tired until everyone's home. Everyone was home. She'd kept the promise. Behind her, she heard boots on the gravel, and she didn't have to turn to know it was Wade Brandt, coming up to take a knee beside her on Overwatch, on her side now, where he belonged. He didn't say anything for a while, neither did she. He just settled in next to her and looked out over the same ridge that had nearly killed them all. And after a minute, he held out a thermos of coffee without a word, and she took it without a word, and their eyes met, level, even, two soldiers, and nothing left to prove. Then she turned back to the rifle, and the wind, and the math, and she breathed out slow, and the sun came up over the valley, and for the first time in a very long time, Myron Holt was completely at peace.